All right, diving in today, we've got this study, Students' Adaptation of Study Strategies when Preparing for Classroom Tests from back in 2007.
Yeah.
You sent this over, and I know you're really looking to kind of like level up your learning game, especially with tests.
Right.
So we're going to really try to unpack what this research says about how students change up their study habits and like what's driving those changes.
Yeah, what's interesting about this study by Hein Brokamp and Bernadette Van Hout-Bolters is they start with this idea that, you know, seems pretty obvious. Students should study differently for different types of tests, right?
Right. Makes sense.
But when they looked at the research that was already out there, it was kind of all over the place.
A mixed bag.
Yeah, so their core question was like, when and how do students actually change their study methods based on what they think the test is going to be like?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a pretty big question for anyone who wants to, you know, figure out how to learn better.
totally. I mean, for you, digging into this is like getting a behind the scenes look at how you learn.
You know, maybe finding ways to tweak your study methods, get better results, and honestly, like stress less about it all.
Absolutely. Less stress is always good.
Yeah, it's like unlocking those cheat codes for your brain.
That's a great way to put it. And, the researchers had a specific goal in mind.
Yeah.
They wanted to figure out why some studies found that students adapt and some didn't. So they developed this model,
Hmm.
hoping to clear that up. And ultimately, they wanted to give teachers a better understanding of how to support students to become more adaptable learners.
Okay.
Seeing tests not just as something you have to pass, but like a real learning opportunity.
So they found this kind of mishmash of research findings.
Right.
Some saying students adapt, some saying they don't. Let's start with the experimental studies. What did they find?
Well, quite a few of these experimental studies showed that when students were given really clear signals about a test, like what exactly they need to learn or practice questions that look just like the real test, like what's coming.
Exactly. They did better.
Oh, interesting.
And what's cool is they also found that those students often chose study strategies that matched those clues.
So it's like knowing the target makes you aim better.
That's it. It really shows you that knowing what's expected is super powerful.
Makes sense. But then there were other experiments, especially with college students, that didn't find that same clear connection.
Right.
What was going on there?
Well, some of those studies didn't show that knowing about the test format actually changed how students said they studied or their scores.
Hmm.
And one study even found that what students said they were doing to study didn't match up with what the researchers thought would work best for those tasks.
So even knowing the format doesn't equal smarter studying.
Not necessarily, no.
Yeah.
It shows you that there's often a gap between what we plan to do and what we actually do effectively, even in college.
That's kind of surprising. I mean, you'd think that, further along in your education, you'd be more strategic about it.
You'd think so, right?
What about the research done in real classrooms?
Yeah.
Did those studies paint a clearer picture?
Not totally clear, but definitely a different perspective. Studies looking at real classroom situations found that students said they used different study strategies depending on the subject, their grade, the specific course, even the type of task they were given.
Okay.
Some students even said they purposely changed their strategies to do better on tests.
So they believe they're adapting, but did the evidence back that up consistently?
That's the thing. While some studies seem to show that happening, others showed something else entirely. They indicated that a lot of students tend to stick to pretty much the same study routine no matter what the test is like. You may be just focusing on memorizing stuff instead of really understanding it or figuring out how to use the information in different ways.
Yeah, just going through the motions.
Kinda, yeah.
And that makes me wonder, like, are my own study habits actually adapting, or am I just doing the same old thing?
That's a great question to ask yourself.
Yeah. The study even mentions one that compared history and biology courses. What was interesting about that one?
So in that study, they saw that both the complexity of the learning strategies students reported using and the thinking skills needed for the tests, those both went up as students moved up through the grades.
Okay.
But within those grades, there wasn't a strong connection between what the tests required and what students said they were doing to study for them.
So even when tests in history and biology had different demands, students' study habits weren't really changing to match.
It seems that way, and it suggests that maybe there are these bigger developmental trends happening, but adapting to the specifics of a test might be less common than we think.
Interesting. What about the age of the students? Did older students adapt better?
Some research had suggested that, which makes sense. But a review that specifically looked at study questions found that age wasn't really a big factor. And even younger students have shown some ability to adapt based on what's happening in the classroom. So it's not just a matter of getting older and wiser, it seems.
It sounds like how researchers gathered their data also played a big part in these different findings.
Definitely.
Hmm.
One study pointed out something really important. What students said they did to study didn't always line up with what they were actually doing on their computers.
Oh, like saying versus doing.
Exactly. And that's something to think about when you're reflecting on your own study habits. We might not always have the most accurate view of ourselves.
Makes sense.
But the researchers also say that other ways of looking at it, like test scores, interviews, questionnaires, even looking at what students underlined in their texts, have all shown evidence of adaptation. So the way we try to measure this stuff really shapes what we find.
So different tools can give you different views of the same thing.
Right.
So with all these seemingly conflicting findings, what did Brokamp and Van Hout-Walters think was the missing piece?
Well, they pointed out that a lot of these studies didn't ask students directly what they thought the test would be like. And that's key, because a student's own understanding of what the teacher expects could be totally different from what the teacher actually intends.
Like, their perception of the test might be totally off.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that perception really guides how they study.
Okay, so it's not just about what information is out there, it's how students take that information in and form their own expectations.
Right.
That brings us to strategy adaptation itself.
Hmm.
The researchers had a broader definition, right? It's not just about specific learning techniques.
Exactly. It's more than just changing how you read or memorize.
Okay.
It includes things like how much effort you put in, whether you ask for help, stuff like that.
And they broke down this adaptation process into 4 levels.
Yeah.
What were those?
Okay, so the first level is changing your big goals, like choosing to study instead of doing something else.
Makes sense.
The second level is changing your study methods to reach those goals, which is what the study focused on the most.
Okay.
Like choosing to study really deeply to understand something instead of just skimming over it.
Gotcha.
The third is changing specific goals within a task, like deciding to look up a word to understand a passage better.
And the 4th?
The fourth is changing the techniques you use for those smaller goals,
Yeah.
like actually using a dictionary to look up that word.
So it's a whole range, from the big picture of like how you use your time down to the nitty-gritty tactics.
That's it.
And the researchers were really interested in that second level, those bigger changes in study methods, the strategies.
That's right.
They defined strategy adaptability as basically how well you can pick or change your study methods to match both what the task demands and your own goals for studying.
That's a good summary.
It's finding that sweet spot between what's required and what you want to achieve.
Yeah, and this adaptation isn't just about the test itself either.
Right. Other things factor in too.
For sure. It's also about adapting to things like how much time you have, what resources you have, what you already know about the topic, even how interested you are in it.
Okay, so lots to consider. This brings us to their model of strategy adaptation, which lays out these key elements that influence the whole process.
Right.
Let's start with the external factors, the things outside the student's control.
Yeah.
They talked about context and task environment. What's the difference?
So context refers to these broader, more indirect influences that come from the way the teacher sets up the learning experience.
Okay.
There are 4 main parts to it. First, the knowledge and skills the teacher wants you to learn, which the researchers say is the most important part. Second, the conditions the teacher sets up for learning, like how much time you have, what instructions you get, and what materials you're supposed to use.
So that's the big picture. What about the more immediate stuff?
Yeah, so the task environment is about the specific cues you get about the task as you're actually preparing for it. These cues can be social or material.
Okay. What are social cues?
Social cues can be things the teacher directly tells you, like, this will definitely be on the test, or you don't need to memorize this.
Makes sense.
But they can also be more subtle things, like how much time the teacher spends on a topic, or what kinds of questions they ask in class.
Like reading between the lines.
Exactly.
Oh, okay.
And information from classmates, parents, or siblings about what to study also counts as a social cue.
Okay. And what about those material cues?
Material cues come from the stuff you actually use to study. This includes learning materials like summaries, glossaries, and practice questions, but also the textbook itself.
Oh, so?
Well, think about the structure of the text, the length of sections, the headings, any words that are emphasized.
Right.
And really important, any old exams from the same teacher. Those can be a huge influence, especially if they seem relevant to the upcoming test.
Students definitely try to decode what the teacher values from those. And the study also mentions memory of previous study test episodes as part of the task environment.
Yeah.
How does that fit in?
All about learning from experience. What you remember from past tests and how well you did, based on how you studied, plays a big role.
Like, if a certain strategy worked well before, you're more likely to use it again.
Exactly.
So teachers really shape this environment, but it's not always a clear-cut process.
No, it's not. Teachers want to give enough guidance to help students study effectively, but they also don't want to just give away the answers.
Right.
So sometimes the information they give can be a little vague or not perfectly aligned with what's actually on the test.
It's a tough balance.
Yeah, it is. And students are also more likely to pay attention to cues they think are really good predictors of what will be on the test based on their past experience.
Makes sense. They're looking for those reliable signals.
Exactly.
So that covers the external stuff. Now let's talk about the internal factors, what's going on inside the student's head.
Yeah.
The model calls these students' task processes and students' task dispositions. Let's start with the processes.
So students' task processes are the mental things you do as you're working on a study task. The model separates these into adaptation of study strategies and implementation of study strategies. And both of these are guided by students' task perceptions, which is basically your understanding of the task.
So how you see it.
Yes. The researchers are saying that to adapt and implement effectively, you need at least some understanding of what the task is asking of you.
And adaptation of study strategies, that's where metacognition comes in.
You got it. This is all about thinking about your own thinking, monitoring how you're learning.
So how do students actually adapt their strategies?
Well, the model breaks it down into several steps. First, there's task analysis, which is figuring out what the task requires based on both those external cues and your own knowledge.
Okay.
Then there's goal setting, deciding what you want to get out of studying, which might be different from what the teacher says you should be aiming for. Then you've got strategy selection, choosing the best strategies to reach those goals, planning, figuring out when and how to use those strategies, monitoring, checking to see if your strategies are working, revision, changing things up if they're not, and evaluation, thinking back on how well your strategies worked, and maybe updating your knowledge about tasks and strategies. It's important to remember that these don't always happen in a neat and tidy order.
So it's a dynamic process.
Definitely. It's back and forth, adjusting as you go.
What about task perceptions? How do those play into it?
Task perceptions are basically your mental image of what the task is like as you're adapting and using your strategies. This includes things like your understanding of what the task requires, how hard you think it is, how much time you think you have, what you already know, what your goals are, even how interested you are in the topic.
So it's not just passively absorbing information, it's actively shaping how you see the task.
Exactly. Your interpretation of the task is really steering the ship.
And the perception of what the task demands is particularly important, right?
Absolutely. Your perception of what's expected is the yardstick you use to measure your progress. If you don't have a good grasp of what the teacher wants you to know or do, you're more likely to pick strategies that don't work or just fall back on memorization without focusing on what really matters.
So understanding the goal is crucial.
It is.
Finally, within task processes, there's implementation of study strategies.
Yeah.
This is where the rubber meets the road, right? Actually putting those chosen strategies into action.
Exactly. Students might adapt and implement three main types of strategies. Learning strategies, which are all about gaining knowledge and skills. Resource management strategies, which are about managing your time, getting help, organizing your study environment, and staying motivated. And metacognitive strategies, which are about planning, monitoring, and revising how you're using both of those other types of strategies.
A layered approach.
Yeah.
The study spends a lot of time talking about learning strategies, especially selective attention and processing strategies, especially when it comes to reading. What's important to understand about adapting and using those?
Well, with selective attention, it's all about choosing what to focus on in a text. This might involve spending more time on certain parts, rereading sections, highlighting key ideas, or taking notes.
So it's about prioritizing.
Exactly. And the adaptation part is about deciding what you're going to use as your criteria for what's important. Is it based on how the text is structured, your own interests, or what you think the teacher is going to test on?
And then the implementation part is actually putting those criteria into action, focusing your attention in those ways.
Right.
Okay, and then processing strategies are about how you actually engage with that information.
Exactly. These range from surface-level strategies, which are about basic understanding and remembering, like just rereading something, to deeper-level strategies, which are about really understanding, applying, and transforming the information, like coming up with your own examples or making connections to what you already know.
So it's about the depth of your engagement.
Yeah. And the adaptation part is about choosing the right level of processing for what the test is going to require.
Yeah.
If you need to apply concepts on the test, just memorizing definitions won't be enough.
Right.
The implementation part is actually using those deeper level strategies effectively.
Okay, so we've got the external context and the internal task processes covered.
Yeah,
Now, let's talk about students' task dispositions. These are the things students already have, the skills and tendencies they bring to the table.
right. These are the things that are pretty stable about how you approach a task. The model includes a whole bunch of them,
Okay.
like metacognitive knowledge, what you know about study, strategies, tasks, and yourself as a learner.
Mm,
Metacognitive skills, how good you are at planning, monitoring, and evaluating your learning.
okay.
Epistemological beliefs, your general ideas about learning, like whether you think intelligence is fixed or if you think you can become smarter.
Interesting.
Motivational beliefs, why you study, how confident you are, how much you care about the task, and what your learning goals are.
Yeah.
Subject matter knowledge, what you already know about the topic. Lower level cognitive abilities, like memory and processing speed. And learning style, how you prefer to learn.
That's a pretty extensive list. How do all of these things affect strategy adaptation?
Well, they can do it in different ways. For example, if you believe that adapting your study strategies is important, you're more likely to actually do it.
No, it makes sense.
And having good metacognitive skills is essential for actually doing those adaptation steps we talked about earlier.
Okay.
Metacognitive knowledge gives you a toolbox of strategies to choose from and helps you figure out what might work best based on your experience. Your motivation can influence which strategies you're willing to try and how much effort you're willing to put in.
Right.
Your prior knowledge might lead you to choose different strategies compared to someone who's just starting out with a topic.
Okay.
And even your learning style can influence your choices, although ideally you'd be able to go beyond just your preferences and adapt to what the task really needs.
So lots of factors at play. The researchers highlighted a few of these dispositions that they said are particularly important for strategy adaptability. What were those?
They said that epistemological beliefs, believing that adapting is valuable, metacognitive skills, being able to adapt well, and metacognitive knowledge, knowing which strategies to use and when those are the core dispositions.
Okay.
The other ones tend to influence adaptation indirectly by shaping the context in which you're studying.
So it's about your beliefs about learning, your skills in managing your learning, and your knowledge of learning strategies.
Exactly. Those are the big three.
Now, this model seems like a really useful way to understand why the research on student studying has produced such different results. The study actually uses this model to look at a particular piece of research, the Thomas and Rower study from 1987.
Yeah.
What did they find when they analyzed that study?
Well, the Thomas and Rower study looked at a lot of students in history courses. They found that while the complexity of both the tests and the learning strategies students reported using went up with grade level, there wasn't a strong link between the specific demands of different courses within the same grade and the strategies students said they were using in those courses.
So the tests in different courses might have had different requirements, but students weren't really changing their approach. It seems that way. And the Brookcamp and Van Hout-Wolters model helps us understand why that might have been the case.
Let's break it down. What contextual factors in the Thomas and Rower study might have played a role?
Well, the analysis suggests that they mainly used the demands of the tests to figure out the demands of the courses as a whole, but they didn't actually measure the teacher's learning goals for specific tasks or the entire course.
Okay.
It's possible that the tests themselves didn't really push students to understand things deeply or be selective in their attention, even if there were some differences between courses.
So if the goal wasn't set for deeper learning, students might not have felt the need to adapt their strategies beyond just memorizing. Exactly.
What about the task environment in that study?
So they did look at some information provided to students, like how long different topics were covered and whether they were presented in a factual or more integrated way.
Okay.
They also looked at the use of adjunct questions. but it's not totally clear how this information matched up with what was actually on the tests. So it's possible that the cues students were getting weren't really aligned with what they were being tested on, or maybe the information was just too vague for them to know how to adapt their studying.
So maybe the signals weren't clear or relevant enough? And how about the internal factors, the students' own perceptions and dispositions in that study?
This is a key point. The Thomas and Rower study didn't specifically measure what students thought was important in the courses or on the tests. So it's totally possible that their understanding of what they needed to know or do was different from what was actually expected of them.
So they might have been misinterpreting the demands of the task.
Exactly. They might have been adapting to other things they thought were important, like how hard they perceived the material to be or how much time they had to study.
Okay.
Their motivation, their prior knowledge, their study skills, or even their learning styles could have influenced their choices too.
Right.
And all of those things might have led them to stick with more familiar, basic study methods regardless of the specific test. The researchers themselves even suggested that maybe students don't really figure out what's expected of them until after they've taken the test and gotten feedback.
So it's a two-way street. The teacher needs to communicate expectations clearly, and the student needs to actively interpret that communication.
Exactly.
The study also talks about some of the challenges researchers face when studying strategy adaptation.
Right.
What are some of the key issues they raise?
Well, one issue is the level of control researchers have in different types of studies. Descriptive studies just observe what happens in real classrooms, while experimental studies try to manipulate things to see what effect they have. In classrooms, it's hard to control all the variables that might influence strategy adaptation, so you get different results.
Right. Real-world messiness.
Exactly.
Mm.
Another challenge is how we actually measure adaptation. Just looking at test scores doesn't tell you how students got there, what strategies they used.
Makes sense.
Questionnaires are helpful, but they might not always reflect what students actually do. And if you give them after a test, the experience of the test itself might influence how students answer.
So there are limitations to how we gather information.
Definitely. And finally, the level at which we analyze the data matters too. Studies that look at overall course trends might miss adaptation happening at the level of individual tasks within a course. Some studies that have looked at specific tasks have found a stronger connection between what the task demands and what strategies students report using. So the way we design these studies really matters.
So it's a multifaceted puzzle.
It is.
What are some of the things future research could focus on to get a clearer picture of this whole process?
They suggest a few things. One is to use methods from cognitive psychology, like the choice-no-choice method.
Okay.
This could help us understand students' capacity for using different strategies and how they make choices when they have options. Another approach is to really zero in on the adaptation process itself. Maybe by studying how students analyze tasks, set goals, and pick their strategies, building on the work of researchers like Bettler. And finally, comparing how students adapt to different types of learning, like test prep versus project-based learning, could show us how different task structures influence strategies and metacognitive skills. These different angles could give us a more complete picture of how adaptation works.
This has been a super insightful deep dive. For you, the listener, what are the key takeaways you should keep in mind?
I think the most important takeaway is that effective studying isn't just about how long you spend doing it, but about understanding what's expected of you and adapting your approach to fit.
Right.
The research shows that clear signals from teachers about what's important and how you'll be assessed can really make a difference.
Okay.
But your own interpretation of those expectations, your goals for learning, and the study skills you already have are also super important in how you choose to prepare.
So be aware of your own perceptions and actively seek clarity on what really matters.
Exactly.
And as you think about your own study habits, ask yourself, do I change things up depending on the type of test or assignment? What cues do I usually look for to figure out what's important? Are there ways I could be more adaptable in my learning?
This whole process of learning and adapting is super complex, and this research shows us that we still have a lot to learn about it.
Right.
Your own experiences as a learner are a valuable part of that ongoing exploration.
We hope this deep dive has given you some useful insights and maybe even some moments of like, oh, that's interesting, about your own learning.
Yeah.
We encourage you to keep exploring your own study process and maybe even try out some different strategies. What are your thoughts on all of this? What other aspects of learning and test preparation are you curious about? Let us know. Your questions might just inspire our next deep dive.
We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.